Okay, I'd like to thank David Nash and Jane Donnelly for their contributions specifically on the blasphemy law. I'm going to talk a little more widely about tackling prejudice-motivated hostility with regard to religion. And I'd like to thank the International Network for Hate Studies and the Limerick Hate and Hostility Research Group for organising this important conference. But there's been a lot of discussion, both in some of the panels and in the kind of informal discussions around the conference as to whether hate studies is the right word for what we're talking about. And I don't think it is. I think some of the behaviours that we're discussing are not motivated by hate, such as immature teenagers copying their friends who are bullies. And also we're excluding some other behaviours that are motivated by hate, such as just personal vendettas. And I agree with Susan Wodlicka yesterday that a better term is prejudice-motivated crime, or more broadly, prejudice-motivated behaviour, which could cover hostility and crime. Because the prejudice is the internal motivation, which can range from an unconscious bias to a conscious level of hatred, and it can be linked to either tribal paranoia or a desire for revenge for some perceived real or imagined injustice. But it's the behaviour that we're really trying to tackle, because the behaviour is the outward action. And that can range from hostility and discrimination through to harassment and intimidation and violence, and can reach the level of the equivalent of oppression, persecution, by not only by thugs and gangs, but also by governments. So at one end of the spectrum, you have prejudice-motivated hostility that can just lead to disharmony and alienation and segregation among people who otherwise could be able to live together more happily. But at the other end, more serious prejudice-motivated crime can be similar to terrorism, which both hurts innocent people and also spreads a message to other people that you might be next and there's nothing that you can do about it. So it can leave not only the victims but also others in the targeted community afraid to go about their day-to-day business without fearing that another attack may come for no reason. I'm going to touch briefly here now on just two examples of prejudice against atheists in Ireland. One of them now, Patricia Cairn is here, of course, who has organised a really important conference on interbelief dialogue earlier this year, which was very effective. But a few years ago at another conference in Ireland, two Catholic theologians, now from their own mind, thinking in theological terms, said that atheists are not fully human. Now, that's not something that you could imagine anybody saying about any other group, about travellers, about Muslims, about any other group, that they're not fully human. And whether or not those people, I completely accept that they were thinking in their own theological terms, but it still reveals a prejudice that they should have been more uncomfortable in addressing. The other example that I want to give which is far more serious, which is the Irish state funds the Catholic Church to run 90% of our primary schools and gives them exemptions from our equality laws that allows them to discriminate overtly on the grounds of religion against teachers, against students and against parents. And again, can you imagine if the Irish state gave Atheist Ireland funding to run 90% of our primary schools to explicitly teach children that there's no God, and gave us permission to be exempt from equality laws in order to discriminate against religious people? People would immediately realise that that's wrong, but there's a kind of blind spot with regard to religion. But I want to make a very big distinction between those two examples that I've given. Because the first one, in terms of the theologians who believe that atheists are not fully human from their theological perspective, we don't want it to be illegal for them to say that. We're quite happy for them to express that opinion and to have that opinion discussed openly. But we do want it to be made illegal for the state to discriminate against atheists in our laws by exempting people who are discriminating against us from the equality laws. We should all stand together against prejudice-motivated behaviour that affects any of us, and we should also protect the Western liberal democratic values that enable us to stand up and protect it without fear of being attacked ourselves. So I want to touch now on how you challenge those. How do you challenge prejudice-motivated behaviour? And there's two different things. First of all, there's the prejudice. How do you challenge the prejudice? Well, ideally by trying to bring people together. Ideally by trying to work on common goals. You can also have psychological or even indeed neurophysiological interventions, such as Billy O'Connor was talking about yesterday, to try to change the wiring by which people view the world. But essentially you're talking about, education and community leadership and psychological intervention. In terms of the working together, Atheist Ireland has always been very strongly working together with other groups that also face prejudice in Ireland. We've worked with LGBT Noise, Children's Rights Alliance, Marriage Equality Campaign, Survivors of Mothers and Baby Schemes, the Campaign to Repeal the Eighth Amendment, Sport Against Racism in Ireland, the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Initiative, and various other groups. We've organised an international conference on empowering women through secularism, through which we've brought together people from around the world to shape proposals for change in both the developed world and the developing world. And we have formed a unique alliance with the Evangelical Alliance of Ireland and the Ahmadiyya community in Ireland, which is a Muslim community, as three groups who have completely different worldviews, and we respect the fact that we have completely different worldviews, but we're united in the fact that we want a secular state and a secular education system that respects all of our rights to hold our beliefs, but that doesn't intervene by discriminating against anybody. The second thing then is how do we challenge prejudice-motivated behaviour, and that's in some ways easier because you can use the law to try to tackle behaviours, but it can be difficult because how do you legally deal with the question of motivation? I think it's reasonable to say that a prejudice-motivated crime that also has other consequences, that raises, as I say, particularly ones that raise to the level of terrorism, that extra consequence of causing further fear and injustice in the community does justify having an extra aggravating factor in sentencing if somebody is found guilty of a crime like that. But how you deal with that is the difficult question, how you frame that type of law. But we cannot criminalise people merely because of their prejudice, no matter how repugnant their beliefs. Firstly because they're entitled to, and secondly because it's impossible anyway. You can't legislate to change people's minds. Generations of citizens of what are now Western liberal democracies have sacrificed their lives for the rights that we have today, including freedom of expression. And to use the Vietnam cliche, we shouldn't destroy the village in order to save it. We have to protect the values that we have built up of democracy rather than throwing them away. When my late wife Anne Holliday and I were campaigning against the IRA and loyalist terrorism, we were also campaigning against the broadcasting ban that prevented Sinn Féin members from speaking on radio and television, because we felt it was important that their beliefs, although we completely disagreed with them, that their beliefs should be articulated, should be debated and should be challenged, and by silencing them you're not going to make the problem magically go away. I want to talk now briefly about, on an international level, the chairs of both main UN human rights committees have strongly criticised Ireland's lack of separation of church and state. Last year, Walid Sadi, who's the chair of the ESC Rights Committee, compared Ireland to a developing country, saying that we're unique in Europe where separation of church and state is almost sacrosanct. And the previous year, Nigel Rodley, the chair of the Human Rights Committee, linked many of our social problems and injustices to what he described as the institutional belief system that has predominated in and sought to dominate Ireland. So these are kind of damning observations coming from independent human rights legal experts from both of the committees that oversee the two major treaties that give legal effect to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But equally, we have to say that we're far from the worst offenders globally. The IHEU recently published its 2015 Freedom of Thought report, which is essentially a rundown of which countries are best and worst in terms of freedom of conscience, religion and belief around the world. And the countries with the best records are all secular, such as Belgium, Netherlands, Estonia. 4/5 of the countries with the gravest violations are Islamic, or mostly Islamic. And they include Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, United Arab Emirates and Yemen in Western Asia, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Iran, Maldives and Pakistan in Southern Asia, Brunei, Indonesia and Malaysia in Southeastern Asia, and Comoros, Egypt, Gambia, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco and Sudan in Africa. That's quite a list of 4/5 of the worst offenders at state level are Islamic or mostly Islamic countries. The happiest countries are generally secular liberal democracies, including the Scandinavian countries and the Northern European states. And in general, secular democracies certainly, have lower rates of homicide, abortion, teenage pregnancy, early adult mortality, STD infection rates, a lot of social, desirable social outcomes that are stronger in secular states. Studies that have been published by social scientist Phil Zuckerman and others have also shown that atheists and secularists are typically less nationalistic, less prejudiced, less dogmatic, less authoritarian, less sexist, less racist, less xenophobic, less close-minded, less likely to see prison as retribution as opposed to rehabilitation, and more supportive of gender equality, gay rights, etc. Now, also, there's a pathway to secular rational values, which is that the World Values Survey has shown that as individuals move away from survival values towards self-expression values, that enables societies to move away from traditional religious values towards secular rational values, and that the pathway to that is things like investment in health and education and communications technology, and moves towards democracy and perceived self-control, if not necessarily real, of your life. Now, the final 2 points I want to make quickly. One is, I think we need to reject a particular word that is used by the Islamic states to try to silence criticism internationally of their human rights abuses, and that is the word Islamophobia. I think we should reject that because it conflates two different things together. It conflates bigotry against Muslims, which is bad and which should be challenged, with criticism of the human rights abuses of Islamic states and Islamism, which is good and needs to be challenged. And indeed, most of the human rights abuses that the Islamic states impose are imposed on Muslims. So it's actually protecting Muslims to challenge these human rights abuses. Now, and again, I mean, we should give Muslims the respect of treating them as individuals rather than as a monolithic block. You know, most Muslims are just ordinary people who are going about their lives in the same way as members of any other religion or none, and that's the majority. Some also, because of that, are persecuted because they might be gay Muslims, they might be women Muslims, they might be dissident Muslims, they might be Ahmadi Muslims. So if they're living in Islamic states and they're under in one of those circumstances, then they have extra problems. So we've got to respect the rights of Muslims as individuals while criticising the human rights abuses of Islamism that affect them more so than anybody else. The final point that I want to make is that we must make sure that we don't become what we are challenging. One of the dangers of challenging harmful behaviour is that we now live in a kind of topsy-turvy ethical world where people casually spread ridiculous smears online, including that LGBT campaigner Peter Tatchell is homophobic, feminist Germaine Greer is misogynistic, comedian Ricky Gervais is transphobic, and Richard Dawkins is whatever defamatory smear emerges from your roll of your dice. And these smears are not only unjust to the people who are being smeared, but they also devalue these words. These words are really important words that we should be using to challenge harmful behaviour, and not devaluing them by crying wolf, by throwing them around like confetti. After the recent demonstration in Dublin against the founding of Pegida, there were a group of people who opposed Pegida, and I'm fine with people opposing Pegida, you know, nothing wrong with that, but a group of people who opposed Pegida took the opportunity of the demonstration against them to chase people down the streets of Dublin and attack and assault them. They described themselves as 200 militants divided up throughout the north side of the city, made up of AFA, Irish Republicans, anarchists, socialists, and a significant number of football casuals. Now, for the uninitiated, AFA stands for Anti-Fascist Action, which is contradicted by their enthusiasm for fascistic street violence, and football casuals are better known as football hooligans, who are not a group most well known for their nuanced ethical and political analysis, and indeed who enjoy not only fighting people at the weekend but also singing songs about how much they hate people. So the idea of these people becoming the vanguard of protecting human rights is laughable, and unfortunately with the internet today, and online spheres, like words no longer seem to have any connection with reality. So they're the basic points that I hope we can kind of keep in mind in terms of protecting people while challenging harmful ideas.